Canadian high-speed rail is so close yet so far away that there is an entire meta-discourse talking about the fact that we are so unserious about building it. But news articles are coming out saying that the government is finally getting ready to announce that we are going to build high-speed rail, and that HFR, or high-frequency rail, which was always silly and a silly name, seems to be merging or turning into high-speed rail, which is good because, as I talked about in a previous video, high-speed trains can also be frequent. In fact, the good ones usually are. This is good because, newsflash, in 2024, a developing country building high-speed rail in a dense corridor while it struggles with economic productivity and meeting its climate goals is a good thing. But with this announcement coming when it is high-speed rail happening or is it doomed? And are we going to stick the landing? Or build a fast train, but a bad fast train? So I've come out of my brief sabbatical. If you're curious what that's about, you can check out my Patreon to talk about this topic because it is one of my favorite topics. So I decided I had to make a video to ramble about it on the internet video site. Canada should have high-speed rail. Other developed and at this point even developing countries already have it. It's like having fiber internet, a public healthcare system, or a reliable electricity grid. It's just something you have. Paige Saunders has talked a lot about this in his various Canadian rail videos, so I'm not going to repeat his talking points. It's just obvious. We have the population and the population density, particularly between Toronto and Montreal, and neither of those are going down. And you get Ottawa on the way as a low-cost extra bonus, so that's pretty nice as well. There are also actually fairly big transit systems already in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, and they're only going to get bigger in the next 10 and 20 years, and so the last mile problem is less of a problem, as I talked about in my Megalopolis video recently. And I mean, at this point, even the US is building a high-speed rail line, even if it's from the suburbs of Los Angeles to somewhere outside of Las Vegas. By comparison, this project is way better because it goes to the city centers of several large cities and connects into their frequent rapid transit systems. The geography is also about as good as it could be. It's fairly flat and there's not a ton in the way. We don't have mountains to cross or tons of huge bridges to build like in some other countries. At least I hope we don't build a ton of unnecessary bridges and tunnels. Looking at you, High Speed 2. So when I hear people go, well, that's going to take 20 years, I am skeptical because there are countries that are also developed countries which have built more complicated high-speed rail schemes in less time. We're playing catch up here, which isn't great, but at least the path is well trodden, so we don't have to go reinventing the steel drum-shaped wheel, if you catch my drift. Unlike Japan or France, we aren't developing high-speed rail technology as we build it, and that's a major advantage, which is part of why it's very annoying when politicians refer to high-speed rail as being innovative. Sorry guys, you missed the boat by about 50 years on that one. At the same time though, high-speed rail really is critical. Flights between Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, cities which are connected by passenger rail, but passenger rail which really isn't that much better than the rail we had in the 1930s, have an embarrassing number of flights between them, as someone on Twitter recently pointed out. These are bad for the planet, a crappier experience than just taking a train over this distance, and economically inefficient. Trains are just better for this type of short-haul trip, and the flight slots being used for small planes to travel between Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa should be focused on using large planes to travel distances that you can't easily do in a train, at least not yet. Of course, part of the benefit of high-speed rail, and part of the solution for paying for it, is remembering that by building high-speed rail, we can reallocate flight slots into our major airports towards longer distance international and intercontinental flights, saving literally billions of dollars that we otherwise would have had to spend expanding airports. And the airports are already going to be connected up to the high-speed rail line, as I talked about in a recent video. And of course, you can make the exact same capacity and cost argument for roads. If we build high-speed rail, we need less highway expansions, which is good for the planet and good for not spending tons of money on pavement. So this all sounds great. So why the but in the title of the video? Well, for one, because there are still some rather concerning hangers-on in the plan. We still seem to be talking about routing through Peterborough, which is something that never really made sense, but which I think was originally justified by the fact that there was once a rail line that went through Peterborough, and hey, if there was once a rail line, surely you could just reactivate it, not mentioning the fact that this was not a high-speed rail line, and when this rail line was built, high-speed rail didn't exist. Even if you're going to try to build a low-speed modern railway on what is now a rail trail, you would have need to build entirely new structures and rebuild the entire line. So you would still essentially be building a new railway. If you're doing high-speed rail, it doesn't make sense to follow this super curvy alignment. Again, Paige Saunders' videos talk a lot about this. And while it's great that we seem to be heading in the high-speed direction, you do have to wonder if this sort of roundabout way we got here might lead to some problems. There are certain different decisions that you might make if you start with a low-speed plan and try to upgrade it to high-speed as opposed to being high-speed from the start. I mean, for one, if you're going to be doing a low-speed plan, you can't do something like, say, the Shinkansen in Japan, where you have an entirely separate high-speed railway. You also probably wouldn't do something like building the new rail line away from the lakeshore cities that already have some ridership built up. There's also the decision to go to Quebec City, which feels very political and will add a lot to the cost of the project without adding a ton of ridership. It just really feels like something that should be relegated to a phase 2, which is probably inevitable if we actually build a project, but we might not build a project if Quebec City needs to be included in phase 1. Usually the first high-speed rail line a country builds isn't between two big cities and then off to a third much smaller city, and that's something they should probably take notice of. There's also the way the project is being developed, which is a weird hybrid P3 type of thing. And the fact that it's not particularly easy to understand should probably be cause for concern. I made an entire video about P3s and why you should probably be skeptical of them, and I think with an even bigger project, they probably become even more problematic. And high-speed rail is about as big as it gets. Like with a lot of transit infrastructure and procurement these days, we seem to be getting a lot of our ideas from the UK and Australia, countries which are not good at building high-speed rail and which build regular rail at very high prices. But unfortunately, because these countries are separated from us by oceans, we'll say that we're getting international ideas for the project, when we're really just getting Anglosphere ideas, instead of looking at, I don't know, Korea, Japan, Spain, France, and other countries that are better at high-speed rail. You know, Australia doesn't even have high-speed rail. No shade, Australia. Apparently the model is similar to the Go Expansion, which is a terrible name, approach to developing a project. And while I think Go Expansion, which is really just electrification and frequent service, is a good project, I think the way it's been executed is highly dubious. It's just starting to feel like years after bringing Deutsche Bahn on board, maybe we should have just came up with a plan and started building instead of going in this circular analysis paralysis mess. You know, like not going, high frequency rail, never mind, high speed rail. You see, there's this huge issue of private companies that are trying to do business with governments not telling those governments things the government doesn't want to hear, even if the government definitely needs to hear them. This just doesn't square well with the real trade-offs and challenges you have to face when developing a project as large as high-speed rail. And I think that leads to a lot of circling around and wheel spinning. Governments obviously aren't perfect, obviously, but there's a reason they're usually the ones to do things like land banking and long-term planning. They're the only ones that really can. And at the end of the day, what a country would build to maximally benefit the country is different from what a private company would build to try to sell a country on a high-speed rail or any other infrastructure project. My biggest concern is if we get a Eurostar type system. That is the high-speed rail service operated by SNCF, the French national train operator from Paris to London since the 90s. The service is neat, but it's rather infrequent and very expensive, and so it's not very well patronized. And because Eurostar isn't all that well used, it means the Channel Tunnel as a whole has been a bit of a letdown. That's because the way things were set up, SNCF, which runs Eurostar, is incentivized to make more money, as opposed to trying to maximize travel, like they would on the route between Lyon and Paris, which, despite the fact that Lyon is much smaller than London, has far more trains at lower prices. I just worry about a world where we do build high-speed rail to Montreal, because I actually don't think it's all that crazy of an idea that we might end up doing it, but it's actually a super expensive service that isn't accessible to the masses, which is a bit of a Canadian problem. Look at the cell phone carriers, the Highway 407 in Toronto, you get the picture. What makes high-speed rail cool is the idea that you could book a ticket, pretty quickly get on a high-speed train, and get to a city that's a fairly long distance away quickly. And if you can't do that cheaply and frequently, well, it's not as good of an experience. You're kind of missing the core of the product, which is more than just a fast train. It's a fast train that has the benefits of a train. Less expensive than a plane, more frequent than a plane. And without all of the security checkpoints and other stuff that some high-speed rail systems do have, but which we definitely do not want to build. If we get high-speed high-speed rail that's at or above today's Via Rail prices, I'm going to be pretty concerned about its ridership. Because I mean, ultimately, if money wasn't an object, you can get to Montreal quickly, just charter a flight. The whole benefit of high-speed rail is that it makes quick travel accessible and easy and convenient. I can really just imagine our government sleepwalking us into a situation where they give us high-speed rail, but it's not actually high-speed rail that's good in the same way that high-speed rail in France or Japan is. Which is annoying because if you know anything about high-speed rail, you would have been able to see this problem in the UK for decades. And then there's the elephant in the room. The current Canadian government is not popular. And by announcing this now, the government is going to tie something that is good and important to their floundering government. And that means that when a new, likely conservative government is elected down the road, well, it's going to be an obvious project for them to cancel to differentiate themselves from the old, wasteful liberal government. Maybe the contracts will be set up so that that can't easily happen, and the Conservatives had said that they support innovative high-speed rail, but if that means a sort of conservative-friendly high-speed rail like they built in the UK with the Eurostar that has super expensive tickets and not all that many trains, well, that would be bad. And with the length of the contracts that may well get signed, and that do get signed for P3s all the time, it could be decades before we could actually fix it. So yeah, I do hope we build high-speed rail. It would be great. But that means I also hope the Conservatives, who seem likely to form the next government, see that this is a good idea and decide to make some tweaks to improve the project as opposed to barreling ahead with something that isn't what other countries that have successful high-speed rail systems have built for themselves. I'm just ultimately concerned because while some of the things that seem good, like open access and competitive service, would probably jive with conservative worldviews, I'm not sure that things like a public, affordable train operator and a strong state planning agency are things that will jive with them. But they are critical for good high-speed rail, again, as you see in France. We really do need a government that plays a big role in the project, that doesn't just set the parameters and then pass the buck to a bunch of private companies. Because that's something that countries with successful high-speed rail just didn't do. Thanks for watching.